No? Is my good now? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is James Dold, and I was invited here to share a little bit about my story, which I think isn't a story that's necessarily talked as much about in the media. It's more of a unique story of child labor trafficking, and to really understand it and give context to the story, I think it's really important to talk a little bit about my upbringing and sort of where I came from and the factors that made me vulnerable to exploitation to begin with. And so the genesis really of my life story is kind of unique. My parents, when I was first born, struggled a lot, dealt on and off of drugs. And by the time I was a toddler, though, they had pretty much gotten their lives together. However, my mom, early in her life, had been a victim of child sexual abuse and rape and many other things. And at the age of 17, had my sister, my oldest sister. And their life, in addition to my other brothers and sisters, was a little bit more challenging because of everything my mom was dealing with, including drug abuse and addiction. And so as I was growing up, actually, I was raised alongside my nephew and my niece, who weren't too much younger than I was, because my sister had them when they were 17. And as a result of this, my house was kind of chaotic. We had a ton of kids coming in and out. My two cousins also grew up with us. Their father was in prison, and mother suffered from schizophrenia, which prohibited her from being able to take care of them. And so we grew up in the inner city of Las Vegas, not too far from the Las Vegas Strip, at a time when there was a lot of gang and drug violence going on in the city. And as a result of that, my dad was working full-time as a poker dealer in Las Vegas, and my mom occasionally would, work jobs and do her best to try to keep up with all the other kids. Very early on, when I was a very young child, I was sexually abused by one of the other older kids in my family. And because of that, I developed a lot of shame and a lot of guilt that sort of built up over the years. And when I was 12 years old, I finally built up the courage to tell my mom about it. And when that happened, I think for a whole host of different reasons, I think partly because it was another one of her children and she didn't know how to respond really. And the child also was a minor, so it was a very difficult situation that I understand now, sort of looking back in retrospect. But for a 12-year-old who's gone through this really horrific experience, who's feeling shame and guilt, I saw my mom not really taking it to heart, and I got really angry. And I started looking for outlets where I could get away from all the chaos that was happening in my house. And so at the time, I ended up joining the Boy Scouts at a local church. Around the corner, there was a really nice church lady who used to pick up all the neighborhood kids and take us to church. And I think so much so, like we're seeing right now with all of these institutions that have failed kids, whether it's the USA Gymnastics or MSU or Penn State, I was also failed by the adults at my Boy Scout troop. When I was 13 years old, I met a family at a Boy Scout fundraiser, actually. And they seemed nice enough. My cousin and I actually were in this Boy Scout troop together, and it gave us a lot of great things to do. And this family kind of took us under their wing, took us back to their house. We would hang out with them, and that was kind of how our days went. We spent a lot of our summer after our 7th grade kind of hanging out with this family. And over time, what ended up happening was that the mother of the Cub Scout from our Boy Scout troop took a particular interest in me. And she started spending a lot more time with me, buying things that I had never had before, right? She was taking me to the movies, to fast food restaurants. She took me to a concert, all of these things. And slowly over time, the walls between what were appropriate and were inappropriate began to dissipate. And so eventually, what ended up being a situation where I thought that this person loved and cared about me turned into an exploitative and sexual abuse situation. It's really important to understand at that time, everything that was going on with me personally was that, I was angry with my parents. I was a teenager, right? I'd just become a teenager, so I'm already kind of rebellious. And on top of all of that, I'm still dealing with the pain of the sexual abuse that happened to me that I felt was inadequately addressed. So that really made me vulnerable to an older adult who could come in and take advantage and exploit that situation, and that's exactly what happened. I told this person about what had happened to me, and that's really when the brainwashing began to happen, where she would slowly begin to indoctrinate me, telling me that my parents were horrible people, that I couldn't believe that they allowed that person to continue to live in the house. I would never do that to you. And so I naturally began to feel the sense of love and belonging with this person and with this family, because at that time, that's what I needed to hear. I needed validation for what had happened to me when I was younger, and all the attention that I wasn't getting that I thought I should be getting, just because there were so many kids in the home where I was growing up. So slowly over time, the sexual abuse continued. It ended up turning into a statutory rape situation, and slowly I began to be manipulated and brainwashed into thinking that my parents were these terrible people and that I needed to get away from that situation. So when I was 14 years old, when I was toward the end of my 8th grade year, I actually ran away from my home, and I moved in with this other family. Now at this time, for folks that are familiar with the term, I had begun to have this traumatic bond with the person who was exploiting me, right? So I'm willing at this point in time to do anything that this person asks of me, because I think that she's the only person that really cares about me and loves me, and that everybody else in my life doesn't really care. So slowly, I get cut off from my family, all my friends. I become really socially withdrawn. All the while, I'm still going to school. To the rest of the world, I'm sort of this weird, awkward kid who doesn't talk to anybody, but still does well in school, so nobody asks that many questions. And one of the things that I always remember about the situation is that, and it comes up more and more as I look at everything that's going on with USA Gymnastics in Penn State, is that I was actually approached by my Boy Scout leader at the time and said, there's a lot of people at the church who think that this is, your relationship with this person is wrong, and you shouldn't spend as much time with them, right? Which of course fed into the narrative that she was telling me, which was that all these people just didn't have my best interest at heart. So when I ran away from home, when I left the church and the Boy Scouts, instead of calling my parents and alerting them to their concerns, or contacting the police and alerting them to their concerns, everyone just sort of looked the other way. And that's sort of what led me into this situation for about 2 years, where I essentially became a domestic servant. Anything that this person asked me to do is what I did. So that ranged from taking care of kids, cooking, cleaning. When other kids my age were out, sort of getting to explore who they were, I was, as a 14-year-old boy, in this home, helping to raise kids, little kids, cooking, cleaning, all the while being the victim of sexual abuse, of statutory rape, and emotional and physical abuse as well. That was the other thing, right? It's sort of this building up, right, where you become almost, you need the other person for validation, right? So I was called everything from a nigger to, an ugly kid who, nobody else wanted or was attracted to. And I always sort of looked at myself like, well, what am I doing wrong, right? Because I'm thinking in my mind, like, I'm doing everything that I can to please this person, but it's never enough. And I can't really explain. I think for people who've gone through the traumatic bonding experience, I think that we have a good sense of, the sense of connection that you feel. And people always ask, well, why don't you leave? You feel like you can't leave. It's, to go through all of that, to be abused and exploited, to be completely removed from your community, it's a really difficult and tragic thing to go through. And I remember at my lowest point, when I was really struggling, I think I think she had just punched me and said a bunch of terrible things, and I started to cry, and I went into the closet where I knew that there was this .22 handgun, And I took it out, and I never in my, looking back, I never thought that I would actually pull the trigger, but I wanted to hold the gun in my hand and think about what it would be like to kill myself, because I could not imagine ever escaping that situation. I could never imagine what it would be like not feeling the sense of connection and not being able to be, and not being treated the way that I was, right? So for me, there was really no escape. And, and that kept up from the end of my 8th grade year till about the middle of my sophomore year in high school. And as a result of a whole host of different things, I was able to eventually break free of that situation through the slow process of time. And what ended up happening with her and the family was that she ended up getting a divorce from her husband. I followed her where she went to live with her parents, and then she started seeing other men and doing other things, and I was sort of left to my own devices. And that's when very early on in my sophomore year, I sort of wandered onto a football field and started playing football, and came across a really great coach, Eric Thomas, who kind of took me under his wing, convinced me to go out for wrestling, and I just kind of threw myself into sports, and that was my way to cope and deal with everything that was happening. And over time, I was eventually able to break that psychological hold that she had over me. But I didn't realize and really identify as a survivor until many years later, actually, when I started to work at Polaris Project, which is based in D.C., and I began to understand the grooming process and what had happened to me. I always knew that something horrible had happened to me, but I never really put it together that I was a survivor of trafficking, because I was like, well, sexual abuse, statutory rape, these things. But I always knew it was something worse because of the fact that I was living in this house as basically a live-in slave, not able to escape that situation. And every day just coming home, it was the same routine: cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids. And that's my story.